So, so today I'm going to talk about practical techniques that can be used to improve your flock genetics using culling and recording. And so, first of all, I want to thank everybody for being here because this is not always a popular topic. Um, lots of times when I'm talking about it, what we get is, culling and recording. Yeah, I know, keep records, make good decisions, cull non-productive animals, blah, 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 blah. So hopefully we can make it a little more interesting, and hopefully give you something that you don't already know. So let's start with what exactly are good genetics. So genetics influence all aspects of a sheep, but what is good? To some degree, this is kind of like asking what traits make the best family. There's no one right answer. And so it's going to depend on what you're asking the animals to do and in what environment. But in general, you want traits that promote good animal health and welfare, traits that are important for success of the production system that you're using, traits that increase or maintain profitability, and traits that are going to be desirable in the marketplace for whatever you're selling. So the practical techniques I'm going to talk about are culling and records. So let's start with culling. Culling is actually the first step to improving genetics on your farm. Culling's where you make your flock easier to manage, as well as improve genetics and profitability. I think most people can probably remember a time when they debated about culling a ewe, maybe because she has she's got a half an udder or maybe a hard spot. But you end up keeping her, and then she turns into a whole lot of work the next time she lambs. So why do you cull animals? There's sort of five main reasons that I've come up with. One, that they're not pregnant. For health problems. Maybe they're just too old. Maybe they're difficult to deal with, or their production isn't good enough to pay for their feed. So let's look at those. Um, if your main product is lamb, ewes need to get pregnant to remain in the flock. So you really need to cull ewe lambs that don't breed, and you need to cull mature ewes that don't breed. And that sounds pretty simple. But there's always considerations that come in. So on the ewe lamb side, um, one of the questions is, are they the correct weight? Are they the correct maturity? Do they have the right body condition score? Is it in season? Did they have 2 cycles as an opportunity? And are the rams working? So all of those things need to be right. And if they are, and the ewe lamb still isn't pregnant, then you really want to think about culling her. And if you do it when she's between 7 and 9 months of age, those ewe lambs can still go to market as lambs. On the mature side, it can get a bit more complicated. They need to be in the right body condition score. The rams need to be working. If you're on an accelerated program, if they're in season, you start to think about, what else has been going on. So maybe she's open because the last 2 times she bred was once in season, once out of season. She had 3 lambs each time, worked really hard, and she's taking a break. So those things can happen, and you don't necessarily want to cull her. But mature ewes that have had an opportunity in season and haven't been just doing a whole lot of work up to that point should definitely be considered for culling as well. So it's also important to cull for health problems. This could be lumps or hardness in the udder, poor feet and legs, or an animal that's limping or keeps getting sore feet repeatedly. Um, if an animal's thin when the rest of the ewes are in good condition, or if she's prolapsed or had a really hard delivery, you might want to consider culling her as well. And that said, if all the animals or the majority of the ewes have a problem, then this could be a specific health problem that you need to solve with management rather than culling. So it's when you have that one individual who's not coming up to snuff the same way as the rest that you maybe want to think, maybe her genetics aren't working in my system. And so these are animals that may or may not be okay the next time you lamb, but they could potentially add a whole bunch of work if they're not okay. So, what about age? When is a ewe too old? And so, what I've got up on the screen here is an example of 1 year's production from a flock. The flock has about 600 prolific ewes, and it's divided by age. So you've got the age of you on the left here. So the 1 year olds, 2 year olds, 3 year olds, 4 year olds, 5 year olds, and 6 plus. And then we've got the number of ewes, the number of lambings and lambs, average lambing interval, and here we've got the average number born per lambing. And so, as you can expect, when you look through here, we start to see the performance peaking around 3 or 4 years of age. And then we get down to five, they're a little less than the 4 year olds, but we get down to 6 plus and they've dropped again a little bit. And so, would we call these ewes? That's a good question. I mean, the one, two, and three, there's fewer number born. And so when we look across this chart, we've got average number weaned per lambing. And so now we start to see a different picture, right? So we get to weaning, what's going on now. And so when we look at these 6 plus year old ewes, all of a sudden they're not raising as many lambs as those 1 year olds. And so that changes what we think about them. And here we see, percent raised by dam, we're down to 88.4% compared to the sort of 92, 93, 94% that we're seeing in the other age groups. And so now we're thinking, maybe, maybe we need to consider culling after 5 years of age. We're seeing a lot of lamb mortality happening here. We're up to 29%. And so age might be something you want to think about, and we'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. And so another thing that you might consider culling on is temperament. Um, you want to cull ewes that don't work in your system. So maybe they won't stay in your gates, maybe they're too aggressive, maybe they're rejecting lambs. Could be a whole host of things that, make you think, why do I have you? Um, and so this one, it's interesting because there hasn't been a lot of research on, how heritable is temperament. One study that I looked at, they tried to do this a little bit by figuring out the heritability of an aversion to handling. So they did this in merinos, and they basically judged them based on how far they ran away from the person under a specific set of circumstances. So, if they're more than 4 feet away, more than 8 feet away, more than 16 feet away, kind of a thing. And what they found is the heritability of that was about um, 0.35 or 35%, which is a moderately heritable trait. And so, just as a comparison, lamb survival is a lowly heritable trait. It's about 8%, and weight, our ability to gain, tends to be around the 0.35 0.4 mark as well. So it's quite heritable, and you can see the difference. And so assuming that this aversion also translates to other temperament issues, it could be a fairly heritable thing. And so um, you know, so when you see temperament issues, one of the questions is, should they get a second chance? Is the you One thing to be careful of is, is what is the temperament problem, or is the thing that she's doing really a reflection of the you being protective of her lambs? Because if it is, that's actually a trait you want. But if she's rejecting lambs, did she have a difficult birth? If she did, that could be part of the problem. If not, you really need to make sure that um, you'd want to keep her because she likely should be on the cull list. And so if you do keep her, do you have a method of making sure that you don't keep her lambs around as replacements? That's something to be really careful of. Because I know years ago we had a ewe that rejected lambs, and we used to not think that hard about it. Occasionally they reject lambs for all sorts of reasons, and we had a ewe that rejected all her lambs. She had like 3 lambs, rejected them all, wouldn't raise any. And so we gave her a pass. We didn't worry about it. And the next time she lambed, she did the same thing. And so then we started to go, hold it here. I don't think you raised lambs last time. And so you go back and you look, and sure enough, she did not. And interestingly, we'd kept a daughter, and the daughter would raise one. And so we kept that daughter for a little while, just out of curiosity now. And the daughter would never raise more than 1 lamb. And we kept a granddaughter, and she would raise 2, but she'd never raise more than 2. So really strange situation. I mean, and at that point we culled them all because it was kind of proving to us that, it's definitely carried through sometimes, and especially in these particular animals. So the last thing is culling on production. So it sounds pretty straightforward, right? Cull ewes that don't cover costs. But it turns out it's generally a bit more complicated. It's costly to grow ewe lambs and get them into the system. Should you cull a ewe that has a single? She's lambed. This is better than those that were open. And this is where you need more records to make good decisions. So, how old is the ewe? When did she lamb last? How many lambs were born and marketed? Um, so, should you cull a 3-year-old on production? Maybe the next lambing is the one where she makes up for what she's done so far. Do you know what your cost of production is? All of these things make it more complicated. And we'll talk a little bit later again about, what are the consequences? How badly do we need to know these things? So when do you cull? Every time you handle animals in the management cycle is an opportunity for culling. So at breeding, you're mainly looking at health. Did they respond to flushing and feeding? Do they have a good body condition score? Are they still thin? Are there any lumps or hard spots in the udder? Pregnancy testing, it's mainly, are they open? Lambing, this is a prime opportunity to mark ewes for culling. So, you know, are they open again? She could have aborted or lost her lambs already. How does she have milk? Does she have colostrum? What's her temperament like? How many did she have? Did she have one really tiny one? Were there lambing problems that she might not recover from? And then at weaning, it's another important opportunity. So did she raise her lambs? Did she have mastitis or other problems that might affect the next management cycle? And is she a ewe that you marked for some reason for culling at lambing? And so now we've talked about culling. So to do a good job of culling, you need some records. So whether you realize it or not, you're keeping records anyway, whether it's in your head, on a napkin, in a book with marks, or using, software and some sort of IT solution. And so to do the best job at culling, you need something a little better than your memory. So you need to be able to identify ewes. Did something happen more than once? How old are those ewes? Should they stay for another management cycle? How do you know if the ewe's lambs survived to weaning? How do you match them? Did you give the ewe a pass at the last lambing when she rejected lambs or when she was thin or difficult to deal with? You also need to be able to identify lambs that are desirable, right? So maybe there's something really great about this ewe and you want to make sure you keep ewe lambs from her. And so lambing's a great opportunity to identify some of these problems and some of these outstanding ewes. And so if you don't want anything complicated, you just have a few animals, then the information that we can keep in the lambing diary allows you to keep some of these records that you might need to cull ewes, and identify replacement ewe lambs. But you also need some information on how are you going to compare animals, this individual animal, to what the average of the group has done or what the average of the flock is. And so for that, we have a sheep management journal. And so this keeps basic management records in one place for the year. So there's information on the animal, the animal inventory, how many animals there are, breeding records, when animals were bred, average group information, lists of animals that you were culling, and dead stock records, and numbers of animals that were marketed and when they were marketed. And so these give you some of the basic numbers that you need to monitor things year to year and see what's going on. Um, so when you're thinking about culling an animal, how does she compare to the average of the flock? And if you keep these books, one book for each year, you can see changes over time, book to book. Gradually, am I using more feed to raise the same number of lambs or not? These kinds of things. And so this information that we keep in the lambing diary and the management journal give you the fundamentals of a basic record keeping system that can monitor changes and help you identify things. And so you need to do this because there's consequences to getting it wrong. In a few years ago, or actually a few years ago, a lot of years ago, I knew a farmer who had, some good ideas. He wanted to get some strategies to make it easier, make things work better. And so he decided he was going to cull all ewes that were over 4 years of age. And the ewes were only going to be allowed to raise twins. Um, and everything else would be raised on a milk machine. But he didn't monitor. He didn't keep any data of any sort to monitor. Is it the right choice? Are these the right cutoff points? And it turns out it wasn't, right? So 5 years later, he's out of business. And chances are that, this wasn't the only reason he was out of business. But not being able to monitor what's happening and how those changes are affecting your production makes it really difficult to succeed. And so you need enough information to be able to analyze. Um, the objective is simple. You only want to cull animals that are not adding profit. So how are you going to decide if they're adding to profit? Are you going to use lambs born, lambs weaned, um, lambs marketable, kilograms of product sold? And that sounds pretty good, but what if a ewe has quads every year and doesn't raise them, but you do? Right? So depending on your situation and your operation, you might keep that ewe, but you really don't want to keep replacement lambs from her. And everybody's answer is going to be slightly different in that situation. And so to really answer the question, does a ewe add profit? You need to know your costs per ewe, how many lambs she produces that are marketed per year. And this is a number that's going to be very specific to your operation. So in this table here, what I've tried to show is the gross dollars per lamb needed to break even. And so what we have on the left here are costs. So if you take your total costs or expenses for the year and divide it by the number of ewes that you have, then you get a cost per ewe per year. And so this cost would include everything associated with the ewe and the lambs, um, you know, variable expenses. If you also include your capital costs, they could be in there as well. Um, and that would give you an overall cost per ewe per year that that is going on in your operation. And so then we've got lambs marketed per ewe per year. So if you if you kept your information in these two books I was just talking about, so you have the total number of lambs that were marketed. If you take that total number of lambs marketed and divide it by the number of ewes that you have, then you're going to get um, you're going to get this number here of lambs marketed per ewe per year. So, are you marketing 1, 1.2, 1.4? I've just done every point 2 in this particular table. So if it turns out I was marketing 1.2 lambs per ewe per year, and my cost was $160 per ewe per year, then the price I would need per lamb to break even is $133. So I also know from this, then if I'm looking at a ewe and is she adding profit, then if the price of lambs is $133, I know at minimum she has to be giving me 1.2 lambs marketed, not born, but marketed. And that's after I keep my replacements and all of that stuff. And so by doing this kind of exercise, you can start to get an idea of what what you need from a ewe to be able to say yes, she's profitable or no, she's not. And so the thing is you're not necessarily going to be able to go into your flock and cull everything that's not profitable because you might not have many ewes lamb. If you have you could have a percentage of your ewes that are way more profitable than everybody else. And so just sheer numbers wise, you need, you need more animals to cover your capital costs and things like that. So there's lots of things that come into it, but you need to know what this number looks like, so that when you're making a decision about a particular ewe and you see what she's doing, it sort of changes your viewpoint on what you think she's adding to the operation for you. And so that gives us an idea of what we think we want to know. But what about the cost of recording? So lots of times, when we start talking about records, people say, I don't have time, it costs too much, or all kinds of things. And so, what are we actually talking about? And so it can range from thousands of dollars for sure. By the time you get all kinds of pieces of equipment and software and make it all work together. But you can also get, good solutions, from the software's point of view for about $300 per year. And then there's your time. And so depending on the size of the flock, um, and what kind of help you have, what kind of help you don't have, how good you are at using, computers and things like that are all going to affect how much time it takes for you and how you can budget your time. But one of the things that I want to say with this is that, it really doesn't take much time to record data in that lambing diary or in that journal. It's just a habit you have to get into. If it's in your pocket and you jot it down, it only takes a second. And if you have that, you can at least figure out flock averages for numbers born, raised, and marketed, how much feed was used, and do some of those average calculations and compare that year to year by only investing a couple of hours to add those things up at the end of the year. Now, to follow the history of a ewe, of course, you'd have to have a more elaborate card system if it was going to be by hand. um, and for a larger flock, it would take up huge amounts of time to start trying to summarize and analyze that data to make better decisions. So you really have to get into the software end of things. So back to this age thing, like this is part of this table that we looked at earlier. And so I've got the age of the ewe here, and then we've got the number that we're were raised. And so, you know, is it worth it? Should we just cull these 6-year-old ewes? And so I say this a lot, but it depends, right? Because not very many operations are exactly the same. These averages and numbers, even though they're real numbers that I pulled out, they could be completely different on your farm. And so you really have to see the numbers on your farm to be sure you know that you're looking at the right thing and making the right choices. And so in this case, we've got the ewe lambs weaning more lambs than the 6+ ewes. And so if this was, the past year's records, and if I say, for example, that last November I culled those ewes that are in this 6+ category, and instead of keeping them, I kept an extra 81 ewe lambs. And so I'm making a big assumption here that if I kept another 81 ewe lambs, that they'd still have this same average. Okay. But if that was the case, if I could keep 81 more ewe lambs and sell these girls off, then I would have had 9 more lambs by doing that. And so, what about the cost, right? So keeping ewe lambs, it's a whole different thing. Um, and so, last November, cull ewes were $1.31 per hundredweight. They were average of 151 pounds, and that gives you almost $200 a head. And so lambs, 100-pound lambs, follow the same process. Again, the same, almost $200 a head. So almost the same. So I can sell ewe lambs and get almost the same dollars as what I would have gotten for the lamb if I sold it. So that makes that more attractive, right? So now these 9 lambs look a little better. And, that's potentially something like $800 more in revenue. And so, if we look at this year, this November, when prices have been going crazy, we've even got a situation where the cull ewes per head were bringing more than those 100-pound lambs. And so that changes the numbers again, where, there could have been some older ewes that aren't performing as well that you would choose to sell off, even if you might have kept them in 2019. In 2020, you might say, hey, I can actually even get more than what I can for the lamb I'm going to keep back. And so maybe, right? So is it worth it to call on age? Maybe. And so now the one thing to think about is we're back to records. Um, you can't tell this information without being able to collect that information and break it down by age, right? So otherwise, you're just not going to know. Um, and the other thing is, you know, when I've done this little process here, I've assumed the whole age category is the same, right? And that they're all not producing well. And that might not be the case, right? So maybe if we broke that out further by 6, 7, 8 year olds, it might have looked different. Or maybe in that 6+ age group, there's actually, a random 15 ewes or 10 or 15 ewes um, that are doing terrible, right? They didn't raise any of their lambs, and the rest of the 81 were all doing, reasonably well, same as the 5-year olds or something like that, which is better than those 1-year olds. So maybe, culling 15 and keeping 15 more replacements might have done the same thing or maybe even more. And so let's look at an example using individual use like that. And so this little example here, again, it's 16 actual ewes. Um, it's data from years ago. And so these 16 ewes were all born at the same time. So they're all the same age. They have, on average, they've got 2.17 lambs born and 1.82 lambs raised. And so over the past 3 years, on average, they've been having 30, there's been 35 lambs born and 29 lambs raised each year. So that doesn't seem too bad, right? And one of the things to note is that, when I start looking at this table here, is that it's not that easy to look at, even with 16 U's, right? So once you start going down, how bad is bad? This one's pretty obvious. She's only having 1.5 and she's only raising 0.75. But, what about this 2.33 and 1.67? Um, how bad is it compared to 1.67 born and 1.67 raised? What do I think about that? What do I think happened? Was there something weird that went on? Um, and and it can get a little bit mind-boggling. So what if we just sort them, right? So in this case, what I've got is on the left here, I've got them sorted by number born. And so now all of a sudden it's really easy to say that, um, in this group of 16 ewes, there's a range of animals that are having, from 3.33 lambs born right down to 1.33. And so I can easily see where that sits, right? These ones that are having, two and a half or two and a quarter, they're sort of middle of the road. These ones that are having 1.33 are at the bottom, and these ones having over 3 are at the top. And so all of a sudden I've got a good idea of how these how these animals look for number born. And so I can do the same thing by number raised. And so right here, I've got, you know, a range of 2.5 raised right down to only 3/4 of a lamb raised on average. And so that just makes it much easier to look at. So all of a sudden you can see that, instead of keeping stuff in the lambing diary, if you can just put it in an Excel spreadsheet and sort that, it becomes much, much easier to see and to think about. And so now one of the things we wanted to talk about is, what happens if we cull by individual performance. So let's say that last year we culled the bottom 3 ewes. So if I culled the bottom 3 based on average number born, it would be these 3 ewes here. And then the remaining 13 ewes would have an average of 2.35 born and 1.92 raised. And then if instead of that, I culled based on number raised, then I've got these 3 ewes here. And so one of those is the same, this 537, but 2 of them are different, right? And so what that does then is the remaining ewes then, if I'd culled these, they would have averaged 2.32 born and 2 raised. And so, just by using number raised versus number born changes how well I'm doing, changes the genetics of my flock. But of course, I've only got 13 instead of 16 ewes. And, the difference between this and this, it doesn't look huge, right? So what if we look at it a little differently? So what I've got here is I put this in the table and I've got these same numbers. So all 16, average number born, average number raised. And we said that, on average, we were having 35 lambs born and 29 raised. And so for that culling 3 based on number born, here's the numbers that we talked about. And that would give me, if we round, 31 lambs born and 24 raised. but from only 13 ewes. So if I cull a number raised, I've got these numbers here, and what does that do to what I've actually got on the farm? So I've got 30 born, but I've got 26 that were raised. And so all of a sudden, 26, I've only got three less lambs, and I didn't have to feed three ewes compared, like I had to feed three less ewes as well. So there's a difference going on. And so with these small numbers, you might not necessarily cull three. Or if you did cull three, you definitely want to select some. So if we could assume that we could select three ewe lambs and have the same average number born and raised as we have from from the group that's left, then from those 16 ewes, we would have 37 born and 32 raised. And so you can see that, you know, by culling those ewes and keeping better replacements, we've improved our genetics and we've improved the number that we're raising. And so what's really interesting is that even though we're only talking about three lambs, it's actually 10% more that were raised. So when you start multiplying this effect over a larger number of animals, it can have a significant impact on what you're doing, and maybe more than you think, if you're not looking closer at some of these numbers. And so even with only three lambs, there's a potential of sort of $600, maybe up to $900 this year, more in revenue that you would have to work with, and maybe to put towards the time it takes to actually keep some of these numbers. And so what are the benefits of culling? So even with 16 animals, culling for production improves genetics. But culling for other reasons are also important, and they're a lot harder to quantify. So that's why I use production, because it's much easier to put sort of some numbers on it and see the impact. But other things are going to reduce how much time it takes to do things, how much labor it takes, um, and especially at lambing. If you have ewes that work well in your system and will look after their lambs, that really changes the whole experience. You're also going to see over time better animal health and welfare with animals that are less susceptible to mastitis and prolapse and are able to keep their body condition score better. Um, and then culling as well helps reduce the chance that you're going to accidentally keep replacements that are from some of these ewes with a poor temperament or have some other problems that are harder to quantify. And so hopefully you're starting to see how culling and records can help you improve your genetics right now. And so to have the records that you need, you're going to have to decide on a system to keep records if you don't already have one. Some things can be simple, right? Once an animal is identified as needing to be culled, you can mark them in some form. You can use a paint, but sometimes that comes off. Some producers will put a notch in the ear or add a cheap colored tag. Sometimes with notches in the ear, it can help you ID an animal that was a problem, but you decided to give her a second chance. So if it comes around to lambing again and she already has a notch, it could be a two strikes and you're out situation. Um, or you could choose to keep, cheap ID tags and paper records to follow the animal. You can use, like some people use colored tags to put in those cull animals, things like that. And if you want to keep things on paper, you can, and you can do some basic averages and basic monitoring. But if you're going to start keeping records on individuals, you need to at least use a spreadsheet and probably some sort of software system just to keep the amount of time it takes down, um, and so that you're able to collect information and analyze it a little better. Um, and maybe you're going to choose, if you have a larger flock, to use the national ID tags and use an electronic system that's going to let you collect information on larger groups of individuals to try and get these numbers and follow the performance of these individual animals. So how are you going to improve your flock genetics right now? You can start culling strategically any moment. Next time you hit a spot in the management cycle, you just need to be sure that you're culling animals with problems and poor performers. You also need to be able to identify the best ewes so you can keep your replacement animals from those ewes, and that's going to help build up the frequency of those traits, um, and cause the ewes in general to do better in your flock. And if you don't have a system to ID those best ewes, you need to really do a good job of culling problems. At least keep track of age and select replacements from older ewes, because if you do that, you know that if those older ewes have survived your system so far, and they've got to 5 or 6 years old, then likely they're going to have some traits that are good for you and your flock. Um, but knowing your average production and how your ewes rank will give you the best scenario, just in case that old ewe is, just just really good at jumping the fence and it isn't lambing as often as you think. So what about the future? We've talked about right now, but you know, what's going to happen in the future and how do you influence the future of your flock? So the main influence on the future is the RAM. So the next talk is in February and it's going to be called Are You Getting the Most from Genetics? How to make your next RAM purchase a good one. And so this will be a discussion of RAM selection and the potential effect of a RAM on your flock. So hopefully I've given you some ideas and maybe some motivation to keep a few more records than you already are. And thank you for taking time out of your day.